My wife proposed to end our marriage for 2 weeks to test the marriage, so I separated for good and said, a real couple would never think of this, I hope you are happy with your choice. That hit me harder than any physical betrayal, it was doubt dressed up as a proposal. I refused to accept life as a plan B, and I left, taking with me the pain and dignity. She thought she had time, but time has shown that love that needs to be tested is already doomed. I met someone who doesn't question the we, who chooses me without pauses or commas. She, in turn, saw that the freedom she wanted came with loneliness and regret. Months later, she sought me out seeking forgiveness. And I gave it. Not to return, but to move forward with ease. Love measured by tests doesn't sustain a future. Today she carries the what if. I carry peace. And even though the pain was already latent there, in that apparently mature proposal to take a break, what she really asked me for was a break from the commitment, a break from life as a couple, as if our marriage were a film in which she could squeeze pause, go live another storyline, and then come back and press play, as if everything could remain intact. But it wasn't a movie. It was my life. It was my love. And so, from the moment she looked me in the eyes, with that false calm of someone who had already made up her mind, and said, it's just a while, we'll see how we feel, I understood that something had died. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was her love for me. Or, who knows, my own love for someone who no longer saw me as a haven, but as a prison. I tried to understand. I swear I did. Silently, I sifted through our memories like someone searching for traces of a crack, something that would justify the point we'd reached. But there was nothing concrete, no glaring episode, just the subtle wear and tear that creeps through the cracks, that grows when left unattended, and that takes over a home even when the walls are still standing. In the days that followed, she smiled as if carrying relief. Inside, I was silently falling apart. Pretending to be normal became my new talent. And while she fantasized about freedom, I discovered the bitter taste of silent rejection. As if the simple fact of her, to want that time was already the answer I didn't want to hear. Time passed slowly. The pain was slow but steady. Like a low-grade fever that doesn't knock you out cold, but consumes you from within. I tried to avoid feeding my pride, but what she called self-knowledge, I could only call abandonment. Deep down, I knew, she didn't want to think alone. She wanted to feel something else, with someone else. Maybe she didn't even know it consciously, but she no longer saw me as certainty. I was just a maybe. And when you become the maybe of someone who was once your certainty, everything shatters. I didn't ask who she was with. I didn't want to know if there was anyone else. Deep down, everyone who's been betrayed feels it. The betrayal begins long before the touch of another skin. It begins in the distant look, the weightless kiss, the absence of longing. The betrayal lies in the proposal she made to me. And there, in that proposal of a temporary separation, she had already left me. The rest was just the formality of the end. And yet, she called me. She said she needed time. That she was confused. That she was sorry. As if sorry were enough to keep a home together that she herself had imploded with doubt. I locked myself in my own silence. She left the house. I stayed. With the walls, with the memories, with the clothes in the closet and her scent on the sheets. Every corner told me a story that now had no sequence. And that's when I decided, if someone asks for time to decide if they still love you, the answer is already given. Love, when it's real, isn't questioned. It isn't put to the test. Real love doesn't need rehearsal. It simply happens, or not. She wanted distance to see if she wanted me back. But I didn't accept being an option. When she realized I wouldn't fight for something she herself had given up, she was shocked. She called me, came to the door, tried to convince me there was still time. But there wasn't. Because love doesn't die with a scream. It dies with the silence of someone who's already given up. And there I was, even bleeding inside, I had already given up waiting for her to choose me again. You don't beg to be a priority. You don't wait for someone who chose to leave. Her time became my decision. And that's when, for the first time in a long time, I chose myself. It wasn't easy. No pain is ever cleansed. There were nights when the pillow became a refuge. Mornings when getting up felt like disrespect to the pain that still throbbed. But something inside me knew that, this time, I wouldn't go back. Because the love that needs testing has already failed. And deep down, as much as it hurt, there was peace in knowing that I hadn't betrayed myself to keep someone who no longer considered me whole. While she experienced her freedom, I relearned how to breathe. And in that breath came a discovery: pain is also healing. And grief also liberates. It was in this interim, the time when everything seemed stagnant, that I met someone. Not in the sweeping way seen in movies. It happened slowly. With respect. With simple questions and genuine presence. She didn't ask me for time. She didn't offer me doubt. She chose me. Simple as that. Without pauses, without commas. And in this constant choice, I understood what I never truly had: someone who saw me as destiny, not as a temporary choice. Someone who respected me even in my pain. And maybe, just maybe, it took losing to discover what it means to truly win. Months later, the other girl returned. With heavy eyes, a trembling voice, her soul marked by regret. She said she missed me. That it had been a mistake. That she thought of me every day. And I believed her. Because true regret has a specific voice. The voice of someone who realizes they've lost something that won't come back. But there, before her, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I just smiled, like someone who no longer bleeds, and said, "I forgive you." And I did. But not to return. I forgave to move on. Light. Without baggage. Without resentment. Today, she carries the "what if" like an invisible scar. I carry the peace of someone who didn't give in to doubt. We are friends, yes. But there's a chasm between those who wait for love and those who have already found it. We've never been the same. Because love that needs testing doesn't survive the impact of choice. And when someone asks you for time, perhaps time is exactly the answer. But what she confessed to me at that last meeting was what confirmed to me that, even if I wanted to, I could never go back. And that's what changes everything. Because there, in that moment, I realized that loving is also knowing how to move on. Even when the heart still remembers. Even when memory insists. And perhaps the most curious thing of all, is what she discovered after losing me. Something that not even she expected. Something that, if it had come sooner, could have changed everything. But now, it's too late. Want to find out what it was? Welcome to the channel. Here, cheating has no glamour, only consequences. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but the feelings, they're real. Our goal is clear: to show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and changes lives forever. If you value true love, you're in the right place. Now take a deep breath, and get ready to hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Lucas and Helena met on a normal Saturday afternoon, in a coffee shop tucked between two tree-lined streets in a residential neighborhood, where routine always seemed to slow down. It wasn't a scheduled meeting, nor a planned one. He, an architect, was waiting for a client who would cancel at the last minute. She, a literature professor, was seeking refuge from the heavy silence at home after an exhausting week of classes and grading tests. They sat close together, separated only by an empty table, and fate, or perhaps the serendipity of meeting someone right, caused them to share the same distracted look when the waiter mixed up their orders. Lucas smiled politely, Helena returned with a slight wave, and in that restrained gesture lay the seed of something that, though neither of them knew it yet, would last for years. The relationship grew slowly, like a tree that doesn't need to rush to blossom. Neither of them was driven by blind impulses or grandiose promises. There was a certain emotional maturity in both, born of previous disappointments and a simple desire, to live a peaceful life, without games. Lucas was methodical, observant, with a sense of humor that always appeared at the right moments, breaking tension with light-hearted comments and sincere smiles. Helena, on the other hand, was intense in her feelings, more impulsive than he, passionate about words, people, and the romantic idea that love could, indeed, be a safe construction. Despite their differences, there was a rare kind of respect between them, a kind of silent admiration that grew with each other, as if they were falling more in love with who the other was than with the image projected at the beginning of their relationship. They lived in a simple but charming apartment on the top floor of a building with no elevator. It was small, with light-colored walls and windows that caught the late afternoon light. Their favorite spot was the balcony, where a weathered sofa served as a stage for late-night conversations, glasses of wine, and plans for the future. On that balcony, Lucas would talk about the projects he wanted to develop, about homes he dreamed of designing for entire families. Helena, barefoot and resting her head on his shoulder, dreamed of writing a book with stories that would give meaning to ordinary people. These were real, achievable plans, and perhaps that's why they were so beautiful. They were never a couple who flaunted happiness. On the contrary, they were serene. They had their good days and bad, like any other couple. They argued, sometimes loudly, sometimes silently, but they never slept without looking into each other's eyes before turning out the light. Friends saw them as an example of partnership. Not because of their perfection, but because of their visible complicity, the care they showed for each other even in the smallest things. Birthdays were always accompanied by handwritten letters. Anniversaries were celebrated simply, but never carelessly. They cultivated the habit of asking, "How was your day?" and truly listening to the answer. Over time, more serious responsibilities came, buying a car, deciding about having children, their first trips as a committed couple. Helena hesitated about motherhood, and Lucas, always respectful, said that everything had its time. This gentleness of his made her feel secure. She, in turn, encouraged him in everything. When he wanted to leave his old office and open his own architecture firm, she was the first to say she trusted him. This mutual trust was the backbone of their relationship. In the early years, there were almost no doubts. Everything was decided between the two of them. The routine was shared easily. Lucas was a better cook, so he took over the kitchen. Helena took care of the bills and grocery shopping. On Sundays, they read books together in the living room, sometimes each one their own, sometimes aloud, sharing stories. The photos on the bookshelf showed smiles that didn't seem forced. There was something genuine there, something many sought and few found. But, like every story that begins too beautifully, there were also silences that grew slowly, almost imperceptibly. They began with inconsistent schedules, meetings that stretched beyond expectations, dinners that were once sacred but became mere hurried affairs. The love still existed, but daily life began to dictate the rules. Helena began to feel restless, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. There were nights when she lay next to Lucas, and even with his body so close, she felt distant. He, on the other hand, was becoming too distracted by work. The new company demanded energy, attention, and focus. She missed the long conversations on the balcony. Sometimes he didn't even notice she was silent. The midday texts became less frequent, and the good morning kisses became more hurried. It was as if something delicate had shifted, and although they both realized it, they pretended it wasn't serious. After all, there was still affection. There was still love. They were just tired. They just needed time. That's what they told each other when, eventually, the discomfort found its way into words. It was at this point that the couple entered a more sensitive phase. It wasn't a fight. It was absence. There was no betrayal, just distraction. Their closest friends understood, but preferred not to interfere. Helena took refuge more in books and coffee with her schoolmates. Lucas spent more time at the office. Saturday dinners, which had previously been religiously shared, began to be cancelled. Each found excuses, commitments, fatigue. And yet, they tried. They kept trying. Because they believed every relationship goes through difficult phases. Because there was still love. And that was what they clung to. Until one conversation, on a seemingly ordinary morning, would change the course of everything. Lucas arrived from the bakery with her favorite bread, as he had for years. The day was sunny, and there was a comfortable silence in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. That's when Helena, staring intently at the cup in her hands, said, "Have you ever thought about us, taking a break?" The sentence came out with the naturalness of someone who had rehearsed it many times. Lucas took a few seconds to process it. He calmly asked her what she meant. And then she explained. That it wasn't the end. That it was just a pause. That perhaps they needed to step away to understand if it still made sense. He listened in silence. The coffee went cold. The bread was forgotten on the table. And what should have been just an ordinary morning turned into the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. From then on, the days became different. There was an unease in the air, a subtle tension between words. Lucas started leaving work later. Helena started going to bed earlier, even though she wasn't sleepy. They talked less. They touched each other less. And, at the same time, they tried to maintain a semblance of normality. Neighbors still saw them together in the garage. Friends still saw them on social media. But the truth is, something essential had been said. And you can't undo what's already been said. Even without decisions being made, the relationship was no longer the same. Because once you consider an end, even disguised as a break, something dies there. Yet, even with all these changes, there was no immediate resentment. There was still respect. There was still affection. What was missing was clarity. Lucas tried to understand if her plea was a cry for help or a confession of giving up. Helena, in turn, tried to understand what she felt, but everything was hazy. She didn't want to hurt him. And he didn't want to trap her. It was in this fragile balance that the routine continued. Silently, they both waited for time to bring answers. And perhaps time will. But the answers aren't always what we'd like to hear. When Helena proposed the separation, she believed she was being mature, balanced, and careful. She hadn't meant to hurt Lucas, but deep inside, there was an urgency she couldn't name. She felt drained, as if life had become a sequence of compromises and repetitions. She still loved Lucas, of that she was certain, but it was as if the love had become too complacent, as if it no longer provoked the shivers, the enchanting silences, the eyes shining with surprise. She wanted to understand what she had lost within herself, thinking that perhaps, by distancing herself, she would rediscover not only the meaning of the relationship, but also herself. It wasn't about being with someone else, she thought. It was about rediscovering something she herself had left behind. But not everything that seems rational is actually fair. And not every desire for reunion is as harmless as it seems. Lucas, on the other hand, carried the proposal like an open wound. He didn't say it out loud, but the separation gnawed at him. Even though he accepted it seemingly respectfully, a silent storm raged within him. He struggled to continue his routine, serving clients, taking care of office matters, eating lunch alone in silence, returning home to face the emptiness of a room where her laughter no longer echoed. He didn't talk to anyone about what they were going through. He kept everything close to his chest like someone hiding a serious accident under the rug. He began to sleep less, to go out more. He tried to distract himself, to avoid repetitive thoughts. But love, when hurt, doesn't shut up. And sometimes, he would scream in the most banal moments, upon seeing a toothbrush she'd forgotten, a cup in the sink, a book with her inscription on the first page. The days passed, and the separation, which was supposed to be temporary, began to take on vague contours. Helena gave no clear signals about what she wanted. Her messages were polite, cordial, and unemotional. They arranged to meet to sort out apartment bureaucracy and everyday matters, but avoided the real issues, the deep questions, the feelings that mattered. The first time they met after the temporary separation was at a cafe. They arrived punctually, greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek, and sat down like two acquaintances who share a common past but no longer know much about each other's present. Lucas asked how she was, and she responded with a practiced smile, looking away. He tried to keep the conversation light, but inside he burned with questions he didn't dare ask. He didn't want to appear weak, needy. He didn't want to beg for something she herself had put on hold. Helena left that day with a heavy heart. Seeing him so calm left her disconcerted. She expected some sign of jealousy, pleading, or anger. But he was calm, almost too serene. And this calm, which had previously been an admirable quality, now hurt her. Because it made it clear he could move on without her. And that was precisely what she still didn't know she could do. At the same time, outside, there was another life calling her attention. A life where she didn't have to be part of a couple all the time, where she could flirt with possibilities without worrying about the impact, where she could feel desired by new eyes. It was in this ambiguous territory that she began to lose herself. It wasn't sudden, nor planned. It was gradual. A message responded to with more enthusiasm. A compliment that made her smile. An invitation accepted on impulse. A touch that couldn't be avoided. Lucas felt the change before he even knew it. He could feel it in the tone of her messages, the lack of calls, the haste with which she ended conversations. He sensed she was no longer just trying to understand what she felt. She was experiencing something else. And even without proof, without words spoken, there was something in him that already understood what was happening. Intuition is cruel because it screams before confirmation. And it was this silent certainty that gnawed at him. Still, he held firm. He waited for her to speak. He waited for her to be honest. Because, deep down, he still believed in the person he'd met. He believed she would have the courage to face the consequences. But the days went by and nothing was said. Only the separation, increasingly clear, increasingly painful. That week, something changed. Lucas received a message from a mutual friend asking if he was okay. He thought it was strange. He responded briefly. The friend hesitated, but then told him he'd seen Helena at a restaurant, accompanied by someone. He said he didn't want to pry, but thought he should know. Lucas thanked him. He said nothing more. But what followed was a devastating silence. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory, every conversation, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything had begun to crumble. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just accepted. And sometimes, that acceptance hurts more than any impulsive reaction. On the other side, Helena was confused. What had begun as a harmless flirtation had taken on a more intense tone. There was someone new in her life. Someone who made her feel seen differently. Someone who didn't know her from years of memories, who didn't carry the weight of daily life. Someone who seemed to offer the newness she thought she'd lost. But along with this enchantment came guilt. The memory of Lucas loomed like a mirror, reflecting everything she was leaving behind. And even though she said she was confused, even though she claimed she still needed to understand what she wanted, she was already too involved to pretend nothing was happening. The betrayal, at that point, was no longer emotional. She'd crossed a line, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize, she knew what she'd done. Lucas, on the other hand, didn't seek confirmation. He didn't confront. He didn't demand explanations. He simply walked away. With dignity. With the silence of someone who understood that insisting would be disrespectful to himself. He began to change his routine. He avoided the places they frequented together. He took the photos off the shelf. He rearranged the furniture. Not as a form of revenge, but as an attempt to rebuild. He felt broken, yet whole at the same time. Because he knew that by not reacting aggressively, he was protecting what remained of good within him. A month later, she sought him out. She said she needed to talk. They met at the same cafe where it all began. Helena arrived first, her eyes red, her hands trembling, and a look of regret on her face. Lucas greeted her calmly, sat across from her, and waited for her to speak. She hesitated. She apologized. She said she'd gotten lost. That she didn't know how she'd gotten there. That she didn't want to hurt him. And then, her voice breaking, she confessed. She said she'd been with someone else. She thought it was just a distraction, a search for herself, but she'd ended up crossing a line from which she couldn't return. Lucas listened to everything with a steady gaze. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. When she finished, he simply took a deep breath, looked away for a moment, and then responded. He said he already knew. That his intuition had warned him long before. That he didn't feel anger, but pain. A pure pain, without screams. He said he still respected her as a person, but that from that moment on, something between them had broken completely. That what he felt was no longer romantic love. It was something else. Maybe compassion. Maybe longing for what they once were. But there was no way back. And that he wouldn't accept living as a plan B. Not for her, not for anyone. Helena wept silently. Lucas finally got up, paid their bill, and left before she could find the strength to say anything. That day, the wind was stronger than usual. And there was a strange lightness in his gaze, even with everything he had just heard. Because sometimes, knowing the truth frees more than it hurts. But what he didn't know yet, was that this wasn't the last chapter. And that there was something more. Something that, when it came to light, would change even the way he viewed the past. 2 weeks had passed since they'd last seen each other. After that conversation at the cafe, where Helena confessed what Lucas already knew, silence once again filled all the spaces that had once been filled with words of affection. He continued his routine with more ease than he'd expected. There was no more anticipation, no more waiting, no more unanswered questions. The pain was there, of course, but it was no longer a pain that hindered his steps. It was a pain that taught. And in this solitary learning process, he began to reclaim parts of himself that had been erased over the years. The mornings regained purpose, the afternoons brought a kind of silent peace, and the nights were no longer haunted by doubts. It was as if, by accepting that he had been betrayed, he had regained the right to look forward. Not as someone who denies the past, but as someone who refuses to live chained to it. Helena, on the other hand, was immersed in a painful process of inner reconstruction. After the confession, she expected Lucas to explode, scream, hate her. But he simply walked away. And it was precisely this mature, silent reaction that broke her. Because she still harbored the fantasy that she would be forgiven in return, that their story was strong enough to withstand this detour. But it wasn't. And with each day, his absence grew more intense within her than the presence of anyone else. The other person, the one who seemed to offer freshness, novelty, a different world, no longer occupied the space that had once seemed so promising. In fact, he never truly did. It was merely an escape. A momentary relief from a restlessness Helena couldn't name. And now, looking at what she had lost, she felt the weight of everything she had destroyed without realizing it. It was then that she decided to meet him again. Not out of a desire to get back together, but out of a need to close the cycle with dignity. She wanted to at least show that she had learned. That she finally understood the depth of her mistake. That she was at peace with his choice to move on without her. And perhaps, deep down, there was still a vague hope of maintaining some kind of bond. They met in a quiet park, on a cloudy late afternoon. Lucas arrived with the same serenity he'd been carrying lately. His face bore an honest weariness, but also a rare lightness. They sat on a wooden bench, side by side, with the physical and symbolic distance of those who no longer belong. Helena took a deep breath before speaking. He said he wasn't expecting anything. That he didn't want to get back together. That I just needed to tell him that I respected him. That I now understood the depth of the love he had offered. And that I regretted not having been able to take care of it. Lucas listened attentively. He thanked her for her words. He said he had already forgiven her. That he held no grudge. That she had been a part of his life, and that never fades. That love doesn't die with sorrow, it just changes form. And that the feeling he carried now was gratitude. Gratitude for everything they had experienced and even for the end. Because the end had brought him back to himself. His words entered Helena like a cold breath. It was everything she needed to hear, and at the same time, everything that hurt the most. Because there, in that moment, she knew for sure, he had loved her like few men are capable of loving. And she had destroyed that out of fear, out of vanity, out of impulse. Silence fell for a few seconds. Helena's eyes were teary. Lucas stared at the horizon, as if already walking in another direction, even though he was there. And then, on impulse, Helena did something unplanned. She said there was something more. Something she hadn't had the courage to say before. Something that wasn't about the betrayal itself, but about how it all happened. Lucas turned slowly, still calm, but with his gaze attentive. Helena hesitated. Her throat was tight. Her hands were sweating. And then she began to speak, in a whisper. She said that the other man, the one she had been involved with, wasn't just any stranger. He was someone close. Very close. Lucas frowned in confusion, searching his memories for something that fit with the information that was about to come. And then Helena said the name. It was the name of a co-worker of Lucas's. An architect with whom he had shared important projects, casual lunches, and sincere conversations. A man who had frequented his home. Who had sat on the porch drinking wine. Who knew his history with Helena. Who had praised the couple publicly. The revelation came like a punch in the gut. Not because of the intensity of the physical betrayal, but because of the depth of the breach of trust. It wasn't just about her. It was about the multiple betrayals, about the feeling of having been ridiculed without knowing it. About having trusted someone who was ready to stab him in the face. Lucas didn't respond immediately. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. His body stiffened. His breathing became heavier. Helena tried to justify herself. She said it wasn't planned, that it happened when she was fragile, confused, lost. That the man in question had approached her with supposed empathy, saying he understood her difficult moment, offering a friendly shoulder. And that, when she realized it, she was already involved. But no excuse could soften what was said. Because it wasn't just about infidelity. It was about disloyalty. About the breaking of all pacts, those of love, those of friendship, those of respect. Lucas stood up, walked a few steps, and put his hands on his head. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't crying. It was as if he were trying to understand how he could have missed it. How he could have been so blind to signs that now seemed obvious. Helena remained seated, her face downcast, waiting for his reaction as if surrendering to a sentence. And when he finally turned around, there was something in Lucas's eyes she had never seen before, a mixture of profound sadness and an indifference that hurt more than any fury. He said he understood everything now. He understood the silences, the distances, the haste with which she cut short their meetings. He said the betrayal had already hurt, but knowing it came from a man she trusted was a different kind of pain. A pain that cut deep, as if reality had been ripped from its place. She tried to get closer, but he backed away. He said he didn't want to hear any more explanations. That everything he needed to know had already been said. That name, now, was the end of the story. And that, although he had forgiven the betrayal, he couldn't forgive the humiliation of having been deceived by two of the pillars of his life. He said there was no more room for memories, nor for friendship, nor for reunions. That she could move on with her life as she saw fit. But he needed to erase everything that connected him to that. And then, for the first time since it all began, Helena truly cried. Uncontrollable tears. A cry of definitive loss. Because there, in that moment, she knew that, even though she had been forgiven, she had lost the man who loved her most. And that there would be no second chance. Lucas walked away without looking back. He left the park with firm steps, but his heart was broken. It wasn't anger. It was grief. A silent grief, for something that had died without warning. Something he believed to be solid, true, safe. And now, knowing who had been by her side, everything made more sense. But that kind of meaning doesn't comfort. It only hurts. That late afternoon, Helena sat alone on the wooden bench. The sky slowly began to darken. And there, enveloped by the memories of what she had destroyed, she began to understand that true love, when wounded by betrayal and profound disloyalty, is not reborn. It merely transforms into a memory. And that not all forgiveness paves the way for reconciliation. Some simply bring the story to a dignified close. But even with all this said, something still remained, something she never imagined he would discover. And that, when it did surface, it would show that not all the pain had already been felt. 2 months had passed since that afternoon in the park. The meeting Helena had believed would be an opportunity to bring things to an honest conclusion had turned into a definitive abyss. Lucas had disappeared completely. He changed his cell phone number, deleted his social media accounts, and, according to mutual friends, had closed his office indefinitely. The only concrete information Helena had was that he had left town, perhaps temporarily, perhaps forever. His absence, this time, was total. There were no traces, no bridges, no signs. And, strangely, that was what hurt the most. Because, even after everything, she still harbored the illusion that they could, in time, build a friendship, maintain some connection. But what she had given him, the betrayal, the name, the humiliation, was too great to be transformed into anything else. It was a pain that could not be reconstructed. Helena tried to move on. She discarded physical memories, avoided the places they'd frequented together, and immersed herself in work with an almost self-destructive intensity. But the insomnia returned, and the nightmares recurred. In some, Lucas looked at her with empty eyes, as if they'd never loved each other. In others, he simply walked away while she screamed his name, voiceless. In those lonely nights, she understood the depth of the love she'd wasted. She tried to talk to the man she'd gotten involved with, Lucas's so-called friend, but all she heard was coldness and distance. He'd never truly intended to be with her. In fact, after the affair was exposed, he'd also quit his job with Lucas and, since then, had dropped off the radar. It was at that moment that Helena understood, nothing she'd experienced with that man had any depth. It was a fantasy, a delusion. Something born of need and dying in guilt. Meanwhile, Lucas lived his exile with discipline. He took refuge in his deceased grandparents' house, in the countryside. An old house, without internet, with tall windows and a porch overlooking an open field. He spent weeks in silence, eating what he cooked, reading old books, mentally reorganizing the fragments of what was left of himself. He no longer sought answers. He simply tried to breathe without weight. Until one day, walking along a nearby trail, he saw a woman sitting under a tree, reading a book. There was something about the scene that paralyzed him for a moment. The simplicity of the moment, the tranquility of the gesture. She looked at him and smiled. An honest, light, unintentional smile. He simply waved and followed. But that day, for the first time since then, he slept without chest pain. Over time, the two met again on that same path. First with distant greetings, then with small talk. Her name was Laura, a doctor who had decided to take a sabbatical after her father's death. She was temporarily living at her aunt and uncle's house nearby. She was practical, direct, and had a surprising sense of humor. She spoke with her eyes, listened attentively, and laughed easily. Lucas felt strange around her. Not because of her presence per se, but because, with her, the past didn't scream. It was as if she knew nothing, as if he weren't a poorly told story, as if he were still just a man. And that was liberating. The walks became routine. They shared stories, silently growing closer. Lucas didn't tell her everything right away. He said he'd ended a difficult relationship, that he was there to rebuild. Laura didn't ask for more than he offered. She respected his time. And that was precisely why he began to trust her. He began to allow, little by little, the pain to make way for something else. It wasn't overwhelming passion, nor escape. It was lightness. It was respect. It was the building of a different kind of affection. One that didn't require rushing, nor promises. And within that, he began to feel whole again. On the other side, Helena still carried the what-if feeling. He was trying to convince himself that everything was fine, but it wasn't. Until one morning, when he opened the old email he still used for personal matters, he found a message from Lucas. The subject line simply read, "About that day." The body of the message was short. He said he needed to clarify something. That, even after the forgiveness, there was a pending conversation. That if she wanted to understand, he would be at a specific address on Saturday at 5 p.m. He signed with his full name. That was all. Helena hesitated, but went. He arrived at the place, a small, charming bookstore with an event room in the back. Upon entering, he recognized the smell of coffee, the wooden furniture, the kind of place Lucas frequented. There were few people in the room. On the table was a banner, "Book Launch, When Love Asks for Silence." And there, next to a stack of copies, stood Lucas. Thinner, with slightly longer hair, a steady gaze. She froze. He saw her and waved discreetly. He waited for everyone to settle in, then began to speak. She thanked them for coming, briefly explaining that the book was a work of fiction inspired by personal experiences, about love, loss, and new beginnings. She said she had written it for herself, but that perhaps, somehow, the words would find other broken hearts. After his speech, the book signing began. When Helena approached, he simply handed her the book, with a pre-written dedication. He said nothing. She left with her heart racing. She read the book in 2 days. And at the end, a hidden, unnumbered chapter contained the confession he hadn't told in the park. The truth he'd kept to himself until that moment. Lucas revealed that he discovered the betrayal before Helena even told him. He found out from a third party. But what he never revealed to her was that, upon finding out, he went to the man and confronted him. And in that encounter, the other man confessed everything, and more. He confessed that he had approached her not out of love, but revenge. That he had always envied Lucas's life, his talent, his relationship, his character. That he could never stand being just the colleague. That he took pleasure in destroying that. That his involvement with Helena was a game. And that, later, he lost interest. Lucas kept this secret because, at the time, he understood that revealing it to her wouldn't change anything. The pain she felt was already enough. And that, perhaps, living with this doubt was part of her path. But now, with everything overcome, he decided to write. Because words, in the end, liberate. The final chapter wasn't about hurt. It was about liberation. And, in the last sentence, he wrote, "Forgiving isn't forgetting, it's choosing not to carry. I chose to let go. And, finally, I'm free." Helena closed the book with trembling hands. The tears came unbidden. Because now everything made sense. He'd known all along. He'd seen it all. And yet, he'd forgiven her. Not with pretty words. But with silence, with distance, with dignity. And now, with that book, he'd freed her from the guilt. But not from the pain. Because true forgiveness hurts too. Because it's definitive. Because it comes when there's no turning back. And she finally understood, love that doesn't protect itself, is lost. And sometimes, no story can fix that. In the field, beside Laura, Lucas smiled at the sunset. He carried in his heart a lived past, a peaceful present, and a future that no longer required answers. Just presence. And perhaps that was what love was all about, what remains after everything is over. The morning after reading the book, Helen awoke with her face still swollen from crying the night before. Lucas's dedication lingered in her mind, as did every word of that last, hidden chapter, which served almost as a final confession, a final gesture of generosity. She got up slowly, her body feeling heavy, as if everything she had experienced up until that point had left its mark not only on her soul but also on her flesh. She walked through the silent house, observing the spaces filled with memories that no longer had a sound, and realized that, for the first time, she was alone in a suit. There was no longer any doubt, no expectation, no room for romantic redemption. And it was this certainty that now plunged her into an existential void difficult to translate. Time had passed, the consequences had arrived, and, try as she might, she would have to deal with the version of herself that caused all this. There was no longer any room for finger-pointing. The dilemma now wasn't between right and wrong, it was between carrying the guilt or transforming it into something useful. During the following days, Helena chose not to seek out Lucas. She understood that that book, that truth written with such maturity, had been her last word. Any gesture beyond that would be selfish. She tried to focus on work, on daily commitments, on resuming some semblance of routine, but everything now seemed too small. The classroom, once so vibrant, now seemed filled with noises she no longer knew how to hear. Meetings with colleagues became rarer. He spent more time in silence, writing down stray thoughts in notebooks he didn't show to anyone. One of them became almost a confession. He wrote about choices, about the impact we have on people's lives when we act on impulse, about how our momentary truth can become someone's permanent wound. Little by little, she began to understand that the mistake she had made was not just betraying a relationship, but betraying the trust of someone who had given themselves completely. It was this breach of trust that prevented her from moving on. And that was also what challenged her to find a new kind of redemption, not for others, but for herself. Lucas, for his part, continued his life slowly but steadily. The book had organically gained momentum. Anonymous readers began sending messages, saying they saw themselves in those pages, that they better understood their own pain through his words. He never intended to be a writer, but he found a legitimate form of expression there. Laura, increasingly present, accompanied him naturally, without demanding more than he could give, but also without hiding. Little by little, she entered his life not as a replacement, but as a continuation. She brought a serenity that contrasted with everything he had experienced before. With her, Lucas experienced a peace that came not from euphoria, but from understanding. She was, in some ways, the opposite of the restlessness Helena provoked. She was stable, honest, and offered a kind of love that didn't need to be constantly proven. There were no comparisons. Only new paths. One afternoon, sitting on the porch of the house where he now lived, Lucas received a box in the mail. There was no return address. Inside, he found an envelope with a black-covered notebook. It was Helena's diary, or at least a portion of it. Enclosed was a short, handwritten letter. She said she hadn't expected him to read it, but that she needed to give him that version of the story, hers, not to explain herself, but to let him know that the love she felt for him was real, even if destroyed by her own hands. She also said that the notebook was the last thing she had left to leave him, and that from then on, she would go her own way, without waiting for any more answers. Lucas hesitated to open it. He left the notebook on the table, went for a walk, and thought. Only late in the evening did he decide to face it. He read it all at once, in one breath. Her words were raw, painful, honest. In many passages, she didn't ask for forgiveness, simply exposing the depth of her experience, her inner turmoil, her frustrated attempts to find herself amid a life she felt was no longer hers. She also confessed that, by getting involved with another person, she wasn't seeking to destroy their love, but to escape herself. And that she only realized this too late. As he finished reading, Lucas felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't cry. There was no more pain there, just a kind of calm sadness, like watching the last leaves fall from a tree in autumn. And there, sitting with that journal in his hands, I knew I was ready. Ready to close the cycle with dignity. To leave Helena in the place she now occupied, that of the past. Not with resentment, but with respect for what was, and with the awareness that what they are now could never be reconstructed. In the following days, Lucas returned to writing. Not a book, but letters. Short texts that might become another project, or might never be published. But he needed to write. Because that was how he found himself. Helena, for her part, had made a decision. She moved to another city. She sought a new school, a new neighborhood, a new rhythm. Not as an escape, but as a fresh start. She knew she would never erase what she had experienced, but she wanted to build something new, on a more honest foundation. She began giving lectures on literature and human emotions, talking about regret, about choices, about the narratives we tell ourselves to justify our mistakes. She never used names, never cited her own story directly, but those who listened knew those words were born from real experience. That was how she began to transform pain into a bridge. And, even though she never felt fully redeemed, she found a purpose for guilt, to teach, to warn, to make us think. At a literary event, years later, Lucas was invited to a debate with other authors about the power of words in the healing process. He accepted. He spoke with authority, maturity, without dramatization. At the end, during the cocktail hour, a woman approached. It was Helena. Thinner, shorter hair, a serene look in her eyes. They greeted each other with a brief, respectful hug. They chatted for a few minutes. Nothing about the past. They talked about their projects, their new directions, the books they'd read recently. It was a light, mature conversation, almost like one two old acquaintances would have after a long time without seeing each other. Before parting, she told him she'd read his new collection of letters. That she'd cried over one of them. He smiled, thanked him, and said she'd always been a good reader. And then, in a simple gesture, she said she was happy for him. That it was good to see him well. He thanked her, and that was it. Upon leaving, Lucas found Laura outside, waiting in the car. He got in, kissed her hand, and drove off. He felt, in that moment, genuine relief. Not because he had seen Helena, but because he had seen that she was free. That all of that, now, was a memory. There were no more thorns, no more emotional debts. Only stories left behind. And for the first time in a long time, he felt he could love without fear. That he could surrender himself again, with trust. And that, above all, he had become a better man, not because of the pain, but in spite of it. What remained now was the final step, the definitive silence between what had been and what would come. And he knew that, when this silence was fully accepted, love would finally have completed its cycle. The chance encounter at the literary event had been like the final echo of a story that no longer needed to be told. They both knew, even if they didn't say it, that this brief reunion asked for nothing more than what was given, respect. And yet, in Helena's soul, something reverberated. It wasn't hope, nor regret for what was already sealed. It was a kind of silent nostalgia, almost a mature lament for what would never be again, but which could now, finally, be remembered without the raw pain. And that was why, in the days that followed, she began writing again. Not about lost love, but about love as an idea, as a construction, as a daily choice, and about how the fear of losing oneself can make us lose the ones we loved most. On one of those nights, alone on the balcony of her new apartment, looking out over the city as if searching for signs, she opened her laptop and typed a sentence that would later become the opening of her first published column: "Some loves die not because they end, but because someone hesitated for too long." Lucas, on the other hand, was now in a different phase of his life. His relationship with Laura had become a firm but calm presence. There were no constant promises, grandiose declarations, or the need to prove his feelings. It was something built on the daily choice of being there. After a book signing for his new book, he was invited to teach a course at a local college on narrative and identity. He accepted the invitation more out of curiosity than ambition. Over time, he discovered that there was joy in teaching. In sharing his journey not as a manual, but as a starting point for discussions about truth, lies, pain, and reconstruction. One of his students approached him at the end of a class and said, with teary eyes, that one of the letters in his book had helped her forgive her father, who never returned. He simply smiled and replied, "Sometimes, what saves us is knowing we're not alone in our pain." And she, with a shy wave, left. It was in these moments that Lucas understood the value of healed wounds. They serve not to remind us of what we suffered, but of what we were able to overcome. As the months passed, life began to settle into places where there had once been leftovers. Laura and Lucas decided to live together in a small house with a vegetable garden in the back and wide windows. It was a home without ghosts, without hidden baggage. The walls were painted warm tones, and the living room was filled with books, plants, and conversation. One ordinary evening, after a simple dinner, Laura asked if he still thought about Helena. He didn't hesitate. He said yes, sometimes, but not with pain. With respect. And with gratitude. Because, according to him, it was the fall that forced him to grow. It was the abandonment that pushed him inward. And it was in that raw solitude that he discovered the strength he would never have had if he hadn't been left behind. Laura simply squeezed his hand and said, "Then she gave you more than she took." And he silently agreed. Meanwhile, Helena faced a new dilemma. An editor at a literary magazine had read her chronicles and proposed a book. She was flattered, but hesitated. Not because she doubted her writing, but because she still didn't know if she could transform what she had experienced into a narrative. She knew that by putting it into words, she would bring back not only the facts, but also the feelings, the weaknesses, the contradictions that still haunted her. For days, she considered refusing. But then she remembered her last conversation with Lucas, his clear gaze, his sincere smile, and understood that telling her story, even without names, could also be a gesture of liberation. Not just for herself, but for others who, like her, had lost themselves in bad choices. She began writing with brutal honesty, sparing no part of herself. She spoke about fear, ego, vanity, and how the absence of dialogue can be as destructive as an explicit betrayal. The book took shape like a naked mirror. And, interestingly, as she wrote, she realized that Lucas's forgiveness was only part of the process. She still needed to forgive herself. When the book was finished, Helena decided the launch would be low-key. No campaigning, no exaggerated exposure. It was a book about intimate pain, and for that very reason, it deserved a private space. On the day of the launch, she was nervous but confident. She dressed simply, as if she wanted her words to speak louder than her appearance. Many unknown readers showed up. Others, acquaintances from old paths. And, among them, Laura. Yes, it was she who appeared in line, holding the book in both hands. She smiled lightly and said, "I thought you should read it." Helena swallowed, nodded, signed it with a short message, and looked into her eyes for a few seconds. Laura, before leaving, said, "You have courage. That alone sets you free." Helena stood there for a few seconds, unsure whether to thank her or cry. But she did neither. She simply smiled back. And that was enough. That night, Helena walked alone to a bench in the nearby square. The wind blew gently, the trees swayed as if whispering ancient truths. She closed her eyes for a few minutes and understood, perhaps for the first time, that loving someone doesn't guarantee a place in their heart forever. That love isn't shielded from human failings. And that, yes, some losses are permanent, but not for lack of love, but for an excess of truth. Remembering Lucas no longer weighed heavily. There was now a kind of tenderness. A mature acceptance of the end. A gratitude without possession. Because the love she had felt, even though it had been betrayed by her actions, was real. And that, at least, was a consolation. Lucas read the book weeks later. Laura had left it on the shelf, bookmarking the first page. He read slowly, respecting the spaces between sentences, the silences between confessions. He recognized parts of his own story there. And others, he discovered for the first time. When he closed the book, he felt neither anger nor surprise. Only a quiet pride of knowing that, even though he had been the one hurt, he had not been the destroyer. And this knowledge made him whole. Over time, he left the copy in a box, along with old letters, photos, and papers he kept out of habit. He buried everything in a corner of the garden, planted a tree sapling on top, and never returned. It was his rite of passage. A way of sealing everything that had been, without denying it, but also without carrying it. Life went on. Helena published 2 more books and began traveling, giving lectures on relationships, choices, and redemption. She became an important voice in circles discussing emotional ethics. She never again got involved with the man who caused the breakup. He had disappeared from the map, and that was the least of her concerns. Lucas, on the other hand, began writing less but living more. He dedicated himself to his home, his friends, and the life he built with Laura. They planned children, travel, and sometimes talked about opening a retreat for people experiencing emotional grief. It was the kind of plan born of mature love, of love that seeks not just romance but real impact on the world. And then, on a random late afternoon, the two crossed paths again. A charity event, an informal conversation, and there they were, Lucas, with Laura at his side, and Helena, now accompanied by a fellow writer. They exchanged greetings, a brief smile, and a final wave. That was all. But within that simple gesture lay the symbol of a cycle ended with respect, dignity, and learning. Life didn't reunite them. But it taught them both that love, even when it ends, leaves fruits. And that these fruits, when watered with awareness, don't rot, they blossom into new stories, into new versions of themselves, where guilt is no longer a constant, but the root of something deeper. And now, finally, they were ready for the end. Not the end of pain, but the definitive beginning of peace. Months turned into years, and what was once a painful memory gradually solidified itself as part of each person's life story. Not like an open wound, but like a tightly closed scar, the kind that only hurts when someone tries to reopen it. Time had passed without asking permission, carrying with it the past versions of characters who once loved each other intensely, lost each other through recklessness, and now walked in different directions, guided by truths that only reveal themselves when silence becomes more eloquent than any justification. And time, always wise and inevitable, took care of handing each person what was rightfully theirs, by consequence, and, above all, by choice. Helena continued to build her literary career solidly. Her books, filled with intimate reflections, gained space on the shelves and in the minds of readers seeking answers where before there had been only confusion. She became a respected name among circles that explored human relationships, emotional ethics, and the complexities of modern love. But despite this recognition, her personal life remained restrained, without major involvements, without explosive passions. A few relationships emerged, it's true, but none lasted long. She seemed to carry within her a calm that, at times, was confused with loneliness. It wasn't a desperate loneliness, but a kind of mature emptiness, where she herself was her best companion and, at the same time, her greatest demand. She no longer sought refuge in anyone, but neither did she allow anyone to invade her completely. It was as if, deep down, she still owed a debt to the past, not for lack of forgiveness, but for a kind of debt that isn't repaid with apologies, but with renunciation. And she, on some level, had accepted that her inner punishment was precisely that, having been responsible for destroying the only love that could have truly lasted. Lucas, in turn, matured as a man and as a human being. Life with Laura was serene and stable, uneventful, but also without gaps. They learned to respect each other's time, to honestly establish boundaries and desires, and to understand that love, when born after a storm, carries with it a consciousness that makes everything more careful. They didn't demand perfection from each other, just presence. And it was in this continuous presence that they decided to take a new step, adoption. Laura, who had faced difficulties in previous pregnancies, always dreamed of being a mother. And Lucas, who had once been afraid to start over, now felt he could offer a safe home. The arrival of a child completed the cycle. It brought new life to the home, renewed their senses, and showed that love, when it's real, doesn't need to come from the same source to be true. But the most symbolic moment of this new chapter was not the arrival of the child itself, but what she represented. Lucas, holding her in his arms for the first time, realized that something inside him had been definitively closed. He was no longer the betrayed man, the man who lost. He was now the man who rebuilt, who chose to forgive, who knew how to leave with dignity, and who knew how to love again wholeheartedly. He was the man who, despite the scars, did not harden. On the contrary, he became lighter. And there, with the small body resting on his chest, he understood that some losses are necessary for life to have space for true beginnings. Helena lost him forever, yes, but not because he took revenge, nor because she was punished, she lost him because she was slow to choose. And the love that waits to be chosen often tires, grows silent, and ultimately departs. The man Helena became involved with, the one who crossed the line with full awareness of the damage he would cause, disappeared from everyone's narratives. Not by chance, but by consequence. He was the kind of person who built relationships half-heartedly, always playing on the other person's instability. Time erased him. And neither Helena nor Lucas heard his name again. He left no memory, no presence. He was merely the catalyst for an end that was already foretold between the lines of doubt. His absence wasn't punishment, it was irrelevance. And perhaps this is the ultimate fate of those who act selfishly, to become insignificant in the memory of those who truly mattered. In the near future, Helena would accidentally watch an interview with Lucas on a national television station. He spoke about the power of rebuilding, about how pain can be the raw material for something new, about how literature saved him in difficult times. He mentioned, at one point, that forgiveness doesn't need to mend ties, but rather to cut the chains. And that some people teach us through love, others through loss. She listened in silence, with a slight, melancholic smile on her face. There was no more hurt, no more desire. Only the certainty that he had found his place in the world. And that, no matter how much she had moved on, she would never again love someone with the same intensity she once wasted. In the garden of his new home, beside Laura and the child who was now his son, Lucas erected a swing strung between two trees. She sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching them play under the golden sunset sky. It was a common scene, but for him, it carried all the meaning of an ending that didn't feel like an ending, it felt like a new beginning. And it was in that moment that he understood that the peace he felt wasn't the absence of conflict, but the result of everything he chose to carry and everything he chose to leave behind. The past, now, was just an old book on the shelf. One he no longer needed to reread. And so, the story came to an end. With pain, yes. But with transformation. With irreversible losses, but also with profound gains. Helena and Lucas never returned to their former selves. But each, in their own way, became what they needed to be. And perhaps that's the most important thing. Because some love stories don't end in hate. They end in maturity. In acceptance. In the understanding that true love requires care, and that, once set aside, it may never return. Whether you've made it this far, with a heavy heart or at peace, comment below what you thought of this story. Which character touched you most? Which choice did you understand, and which would you never make? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more stories like this, designed to move and make you reflect. This story was a clear portrayal of what betrayal can destroy. It doesn't just destroy relationships, but trust, family bonds, and future possibilities. Love, once betrayed, is never the same again. And often, it's irreversibly lost. Think carefully about your choices. Think about who truly loves you. Because there isn't always a second chance. And even when there is forgiveness, there isn't always a return. The channel does not support, romanticize or justify any type of betrayal here. We believe that loyalty, respect and truth are still the pillars of true love. Until the next story. And remember, what you do to someone's heart, comes back. It always comes back.